Hello, I'm Susanna Wright and I'm an account director at Highland Marketing.
And hello, I'm Matthew Darcy. I'm a senior communications consultant with Highland Marketing. Welcome to this module of our communications course. And we're going to talk to you today about how to build a story, which is fundamental for getting your good news out there. We're going to talk to you about how you can understand what is newsworthy. We're going to discuss when and what to communicate, how you can go about gathering the right sort of evidence that might make a compelling piece, and also how you can think about the various different drivers and strategies that might be relating to the work you're doing and how you're addressing some of the local and national issues across the country that might be useful for you to tie into. And then we're going to help you think about your audiences and how you can engage with them. And then finally, beyond that, we're going to bring you an interview with a former journalist in the sector, Lynn Whitfield, who has a lot of experience in healthcare and is going to tell you her perspectives on what makes a good story for a journalist.
So let's look at understanding what is newsworthy. When we consider what is newsworthy, what we mean is what are the things that will appeal to a target audience and make them want to find out more about what's being presented to them. As you probably know, the media landscape is wide in scope, and one of the benefits to UK society is that there is a free press, unimpeded by interference from the state. While many people dislike the influence of wealthy media moguls and dispute the output of some publications, the freedom to publish any content in line with certain standards means that there are a variety of outlets to consider. Consequently, the variety of viewpoints and types of story can make it confusing as to what is news. In general, however, we should think about the events and activities that form a natural milestone. For publications to regard something as newsworthy enough to write about, there are several factors they will look for. We'll go through these in a bit more detail now. So firstly, the information must be new. It might sound obvious, but newsworthy stories are those that present something that has not been made public before. Another thing we should look at is the information must be unique in some way. This is the second factor we can consider. So editors want to publish stories that are different from their competitors' outputs. And while this is difficult when outlets receive a press release that has been sent to many other publications, they may want to create their own angle. So when we look at national newspapers, for example, we can see that on any day, one story might be written in slightly different ways in various publications, depending on such factors as political persuasion, geographic location, or cultural influence. So as an example, in 2016, one Scottish newspaper announced that Donald Trump had won the US election with the headline, "Aberdeenshire business owner wins presidential election." This is quite a comical way of putting it and a bit of a ploy on behalf of the publication, but it illustrates that each publication has its own focus and aims of generating reader interest. So in remembering this need for uniqueness or an angle, health and care organisations should think about what they have to talk about that differentiates them from others. It could be that they're the first trust to receive some particular funding, or they have a new clinic that is the first of its kind in the country or a particular area, or perhaps there's some trial data that suggests some groundbreaking findings. Or it could be something much more personal, such as that a midwife who is retiring has delivered babies in the local area for the past 40 years. Whatever the topic is, you and your team should think about how this makes you different and why a reader might be interested to find out more. So the third thing we can think about is the information must be relevant. So for many people, relevancy can be a flexible concept, but we need to consider why a publication might want to publish your information. The editor will only publish an article about something that they think the readers will be interested in. And in this sense, the relevancy could fall into these three broad categories. So it must be significant, and by that we mean something that affects many people or a particular group of people and is therefore an issue they should be aware of. It could be thematic, so the information might be something that the publication usually covers.
So that might be particular areas of government policy, whether that's national or local government. It might be focusing on various clinical specialities, whether that's things like radiology, cardiology, oncology, that's just named a few. It could be aspects of social care. It might be issues like healthcare technology or a great many other things. But importantly, paying attention to the themes of a publication and what it covers can help you to gain coverage because you can respond to that in a relevant way.
We can think about geographic relevancy. So these are issues that affect a particular area. For example, what is happening in the town's hospital or community care team. Well, when you're thinking about whether your information is relevant, also just try and think about why it might not be and whether that could change.
So, for example, ordinarily, a press release on a new maternity clinic in one town probably wouldn't be of interest to a newspaper reporting on issues in a city that's 100 miles away. It's simply not relevant for their readers. But if one element of that story was that the town's new head of maternity services has just left a similar role in the city environment, where perhaps improvements that have been implemented may have led to significant reductions in infant mortality, then the newspapers in both cities might be interested in that story.
As well as thinking of relevancy of the information overall, consider what other elements of the information might be brought out that could make the story relevant to a variety of media outlets.
So when you're trying to build a story, it's important to think about when and what to communicate. On the previous slide that Susanna was talking through, we actually listed a few examples of ideas that might be relevant to people working in health and care. So there's just a few examples. It might be that there's been new funding within a hospital or a department that you want to shout about. It could be that there's been a new or significant appointment of a respected professional within your team. You might have developed a new service for patients or potentially new opportunities for staff. It could be that you've carried out research or that you have some new great results from a clinical trial that you really want to shout about. You might have reduced waiting times or achieved high ratings with patient satisfaction surveys, or you might have been cited positively in an external report, perhaps something like a CQC report. Or perhaps you've gone live with a new piece of technology, and that's going to help you transform your service. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but hopefully it gives you some ideas of the sorts of things that you might talk about. They might be things that you think of as just doing your job, but in fact, they could be quite significant in sharing best practice and ideas, and that could be the sort of thing that gets the attention of journalists. It is also worth noting that the media are also often interested in what you might see as negative stories. They often have a duty to report on the activity in publicly funded organisations, and if there's an element of public interest there. But for the purposes of this module, we're focusing largely on how you can build positive stories. And when we think about the timing of some of the examples we've just outlined there, it's worthwhile considering that in some instances, you might want to communicate certain things internally with your team or with internal stakeholders before putting them into a press release, unless there's perhaps good reason not to do that. For example, when there might be sensitive information that you cannot share until it's been made public. But think about the implications perhaps of when you're communicating a new service or the reconfiguration of a service. Will that affect people's jobs? Is that a conversation you need to have internally first before shouting about what is otherwise a great story to the outside world, just to avoid any potential negative implications from that? Talk all that through with your comms team, though, if you have one. See what advice you can get from them. And if you don't have one, there may be other sources of external advice that you can turn to. And we mentioned sensitive information there, and that is worth thinking about in any form of communication that you engage in. Make sure that you don't share anything that you shouldn't. That might, for example, be commercially sensitive information or about patient information. Whether you're hoping to communicate a good story or not, this is really important, and you certainly don't want to undermine your story by accidentally breaching any confidences. So there's some other things to think about. You might be the only organization or perhaps the first organization to do something. And that can put you in a strong position when it comes to creating a story and pushing it out there. It might give you a degree of flexibility on when you decide to communicate something. On the one hand, you might actually decide that you want to act quite quickly before somebody else announces a similar achievement. Or on the other hand, you might decide that you want to wait until your evidence is as strong as it can be to make sure you get the best story you can out there. These are things to think about as you're developing your strategy. We thought it was important to touch on competition a little bit. Now, this might be something that you think about being more relevant to private businesses. But in the sense of communicating things to the media, journalists want to report on things that are new. So it might be that if another trust is going to communicate something quite soon, you might want to get in there first. Just be aware that there is competition for space in the media. And it's also worth being aware of other activity that's going on in your organization. As we've mentioned throughout this course, it's always useful to engage your communications team early. They can be a point of gaining clearance and approval for your content and communications, but also they can be a helpful advice point. They might be aware of other stories that are being published about things that are happening with your organization. And one thing you don't want to do is compete with your own organization, with your colleagues, for space in the media. Do things in a way that's coordinated, and they might be able to help you understand when you can do certain things to greatest effect. It's also worth thinking about external factors when it comes to communication, and that can play a role in both the content and the timing of what you want to talk about. Be aware of the news agenda, and that might influence how you go about positioning certain things within your story. It might also influence when you decide to distribute a story. If there's a particularly busy time in the media, you don't want your story to get buried. And it's also within that worth thinking about things like policy and regulatory changes that might be happening in the marketplace. We'll touch on that a little bit more when we discuss drivers later in the module. And there might also be legal reasons that you need to consider that might inform what you say and when you say it. Again, we recommend that you liaise with your communications colleagues to get the best advice. But to give you some examples, be aware of things like PERDA, which can impose restrictions on when you're allowed to say certain things during election periods. Or there may be contractual rules that you need to adhere to. It might be, for example, that if you're announcing something with one of your suppliers, they might have a certain requirement to announce certain things to the market at a certain time. And a final thought to think about is newsjacking. And effectively, this means hijacking a story that's in the media to get your own thoughts or your organization's stance aligned with that story. It's often also known as a proactive press office approach. And to do this effectively, you need to be quick off the mark. Now, the following slide gives some examples of this in action. In this particular case, the organizations represented here have responded to a spending review. Now, they probably had their responses ready for some time, knowing this is coming up, and they will have coordinated that through an approval process within their organization and then pushed them out to the media, perhaps sometimes in advance of the spending review coming out, or if not, shortly afterwards. They can often be a good way of populating your social media, of getting your comments into the press around relevant things that are happening, and of perhaps even stimulating interest for interviews from journalists. It's important that you think about what you can add to the conversation in here if you're to do this well, and as ever, to make sure that you do get the necessary approvals to do this. And we've just given you this example here, but there's likely to be many things out there in the news relevant to what you're doing. So, for example, it could be that there is a particular story around a clinical area that you have expertise in, and it might be that you can lend an authoritative voice to that. And just to illustrate another thing that Susanna has mentioned quite a number of times already throughout this particular module, and that's the value of technology as a mechanism to gain coverage, to get a story out there. Of course, many parts of healthcare use technology in their day-to-day operations, but it's becoming ever more increasingly important as a way of improving the delivery, efficiency and effectiveness of services throughout health and social care. And the examples of coverage on this page here are just some of the stories that have been picked up by media because they can really see the value in what's happening in this environment. And that ranges from specialist publications focused on the more digital health environment through to nationals, through to local media. There can be a really significant impact from this. And so it's perhaps something that you might want to think about in your own practice. How do you use technology? Have you got a technology go live coming up? Is there something that you're achieving through the use of technology that could be a useful story to share with your peers to showcase innovation?
So now we're going to look at gathering the evidence. So to create a piece of content, whether to be distributed to the media, such as a press release or a case study, or for another use, such as for a patient newsletter, a marketing flyer, a video script, or social media post, various pieces of information need to be gathered. So these are going to form the basis of your story and should back up any claims that you make. So firstly, let's look at the raw materials. This is the information that's going to form the basis of your piece. It's the who, what, when, where, why, and how elements. So looking back at what we said about relevancy, being able to identify these aspects should indicate why your story is worth being told and read. Then we have metrics. So these are the facts, statistics, or other findings that validate the truth of your story. These might be produced by your organisation or external source. And if it's the latter, can you verify them? You need to think about whether they're conclusive or whether there might be some debate as to what they show. And remember that if you're only showing partial data, this might give a misleading impression, and you could be required to defend why you've chosen only some bits of information.
So the images you can see on this slide are a really good way to illustrate metrics in action in the media. In this case, NHS 5 had deployed a system called PatientTrack, which is now owned and provided to the NHS by a company called Alcidion. And particularly PatientTrack was an early warning e-observation system that had helped the hospital deliver a step change in how clinical practice was delivered. And more than that, there were some really important metrics behind what had been achieved. And the hospital in question had identified that they'd reduced cardiac arrests by 2/3 in their busiest hospital area, only months after deploying the technology. Now, that really got the attention of the media in this case. Both local media, regional media, national media, and trade media all combined. You might notice an interest in different aspects of the story, going back to Susanna's earlier points in this module around making sure that you target things in the right, relevant way for the media. But interestingly, also behind that, there were lots of perspectives. There were nurses contributing to the story, doctors, senior leaders in the hospital, all willing to lend their voice to the press release that eventually went out to the media. And I think that had a real impact on the way it was received. And I think in this particular case, in fact, one of the newspapers in Scotland picked up on the opportunity in the hospital as being a real breath of fresh air for the NHS. So it was incredibly positively received. So it's a great example of how you can use metrics. Think about that in the context of your own team, your own department, your own organisation. Things that you might just think perhaps are just part of your job could in fact be really interesting to the outside world if presented in a positive way. But as Susanna says, as you present those numbers, you've also got to make sure that you can back them up. So be sure that they do stand up.
So the third aspect of evidence is authoritative quotes. These are the quotes from the people used in your content. They need to strengthen the angle of what you're creating and must be relevant. And they should not simply reiterate what you have said in narrative text. Consider also that different people have different roles and therefore the quote should reflect that. So for example, if you're creating quotes on behalf of the CEO, their focus is likely to be on the organisational vision or strategy, the bigger picture issues. But if you're creating a quote on behalf of a clinician, their focus is more likely to be on the day-to-day work that's been carried out in a hospital. Remember that if you are drafting quotes on behalf of someone, they may want to make changes and they must approve them before the text is issued and used in any way. So as well as authoritative quotes, we should also think about personal stories. So these are the anecdotes, bits of information and quotes on patients, staff or service users. They add a human touch to the content to make the story interesting to the reader. If someone can relate to the personalities in an article, they're more likely to be engaged with what is being said and more likely to remember it in future.
So the images you can see on this slide are a great example of how you can really use those different perspectives, those different authoritative quotes in a story. In this case, they all actually came from the same story, but you can see here that we've got representation from a CEO level right through to clinical leads, to project leads, and many others involved in the program. And I think what that does is it gives the publications the opportunity to select the quotes that are useful to their readers. It also demonstrates, in this particular case, that there are lots of people in the organization that see the project here as important. So it just adds that additional weight to it. And this is a great way of really reinforcing the value of your story. So when you're applying this in the context of your own organization, if it is that you have something similar to this, a technology go live, think about who you might want to approach for a quote. That might be the person running the project who knows the fundamentals of it. It might be a user who's found it really beneficial. It might be a patient whose experiences have changed as a result of this technology being implemented. Or it could be a senior leader that's acting as a senior stakeholder in the organization for the particular project that you're running. So, and that might be the same principle that you apply to lots of different stories as you start to build that evidence, far more than just a technology story. So we hope that's useful. So it's often said that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and we are increasingly visual in the way that we consume media through our phones, through our tablet devices or laptops, whatever that might be. And so often it's the case that if you have a way of visually representing a story, it can add a lot of value to the people consuming that content. It can help them to want to find out more. And this applies certainly to journalists. If you can support something that you're creating content-wise with the right images, you might help them when it comes to publishing that particular story. And by that, we don't mean static images of people looking at a camera, but you can use images to bring your story to life. So, for example, if you have a technology go live, you might want to show that technology in action. But be careful. Make sure you have the right permissions to use images and that you have the necessary permission from people who might be in those pictures. Speak to your comms team about the rules in your own organization about collecting images and taking images, and be careful not to reveal any sensitive information inadvertently through them. So hopefully all the information we've given you so far is a good grounding to start to think about how you can form a story. What are the components that go into it? What might form the basis of something that goes into a press release? We haven't given you the detail on how to write a press release or how to write a case study. That's not what this course is about. What we want to give you is the grounding to start to gather the right materials that you can then work with your communications team or with your PR agency in developing. But when you now take these components, how are you going to present that is still an important question that you need to think about. And one of the things that you need to consider in doing that is who is your audience? Now, on this slide, there's a wide range of different organizations and different individuals listed. So you've got everything from trade bodies through to the media, through to NHS or social care colleagues. You've got politicians, podcasts. The list goes on about the different sorts of individuals you want to influence. And that's important to think about because it might help to define the ways in which you position some of the material that you've gathered. And it might even influence what material you gather. So bear that in mind. Have that conversation with your communications team as you start to try and work with them to form a piece of communication or a piece of content. And then finally, within this context, think about the drivers in your sector. So on this page, we've got some strategies that are out there at the moment in the NHS and in social care. It's important that you think about things like this because it might help you to think about what is relevant out there at the moment. So, for example, are there things in the NHS long-term plan that your organisation is actually making a contribution towards? Are you helping, for example, to redesign a pathway that might reduce cancer waiting times? And as Susanna mentioned earlier, the drivers that are out there are changing continually, with COVID being a key transformative factor in that, where all of a sudden the pressures being faced now by the NHS are somewhat different to what they might have been several years ago when the NHS long-term plan was launched. So are you, for example, doing things to tackle the backlog? Are you doing things to change how certain services are run that might be an exemplar out there to others? Are there things coming out from Royal Colleges that you might want to respond to that you're actually doing really well as an organisation? Just be aware of things that are out there in your sector, of the key drivers, the key strategies, and how you as an organisation, you as a team, could be at the cutting edge of solving some of the challenges nationally. That could also extend locally. So it could be that there are things within your local community that you want to respond to as well. And just to try and bring some of what we've been describing here to life, we're going to bring to you now an interview that we did earlier with a former journalist in the sector, Lynn Whitfield, who has worked extensively across the healthcare press. We're here to speak to Lynn Whitfield, who is a content director with Harlan Marketing. But before that, Lynn was a journalist for quite a number of years, working across a range of different titles, including a significant amount of experience within healthcare. And Lynn's here today to give us her experience in terms of what makes a good story. So, Lynn, why don't you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Okay, so as you said, Matthew, I'm a journalist by background. I trained in local newspapers and was a court reporter for a while, so quite a hard news background. But on one of the publications that I worked for, I ended up as health correspondent. And since then, the NHS has never let me go, really. So I moved on to work for the Health Service Journal for a while. And subsequently, I got very interested in technology. And my last job in journalism was as managing editor of digitalhealth.net, eHealth Insider as it was. So that was absolutely all about the National Programme for IT and then subsequently the NHS's attempts to digitise, which is what we're still writing about now.
That's great. Thank you, Lynn. So I know from experience that journalists receive lots of press releases. They're very busy people. Just how busy can your inbox get? How many press releases and other stories simply don't get picked up on?
Oh, they get very busy. If you're sat there on a news desk and you're handling news and features and perhaps promotional items as well, you're going to get dozens of emails every hour. It's very, very hard to keep on top of them all. So yes, absolutely. Standing out and making sure that you get your message across quickly is completely key. And to be honest, if you don't make your pitch very, very quickly, it's not going to be read. And frankly, you're not going to be picked up, I'm afraid.
So what are the key things that would make you consider writing about somebody's work or perhaps the achievements of an organisation in the NHS or in social care? How can you get the attention of the journalist receiving the content?
I think the key is to think through in advance, what is the publication that I'm contacting? What are they interested in? What do they want to write about? What do they think their readers are going to want to read about? Why would I want to tell their readers about what it is that I've done? Because if you really get that clear in your own mind, then when it comes to putting together a press release or an email for a journalist, you can be absolutely clear about saying, this is the story, this is why it matters, this is why you should cover it. We've got these great assets, ready to go, so you can do a great job for your publication and your readers. It's really that clarity and being concise and being very clear up front and making sure that the journalist gets it very, very quickly just what it is that you're talking about and why that's absolutely something they should be covering.
So that's a really useful insight then. Of course, PR agencies can be really good at doing that, as can a communications team within a trust or within an organization. And we both work in the PR environment now. Does it have to be a PR person to contact journalists?
No, absolutely not. So most journalists love hearing from their readers, and they love hearing from people who are doing work in the field that they're interested in. So from that point of view, there's absolutely no reason why it should be a PR agency or a comms team. What I would say is that a PR agency can be useful to you in terms of framing up that story, making sure everything's ready to go, and they can do a lot of the legwork. We were just talking about how busy journalist inboxes get. If you want to follow up with 5 or 6 different publications, and perhaps you need to follow up a few times before they finally read that email and engage with what it is that you've got to say, just having someone else there to do all of that work can be really helpful. And similarly, a PR firm can actually work with your trust comms team. They're very busy people as well, but keeping them in the loop's really important. Making sure that they know what's going out from the trust is very important. And PR firms can actually, make sure that they do a good job as well.
And of course, one of the things that you might imagine would be important is the relationship with the journalists as well. And some agencies may well have those already established. So perhaps that's a resource that can be drawn on.
Yes, absolutely. And if you're thinking about a huge organisation as well, like a big national paper or a broadcaster like the BBC, they're more likely to know which journalists. If you're sitting there on the outside, where do you even begin? It's really complicated, isn't it? Just to get your head around the hierarchy and the structures.
So a moment ago, we spoke about the idea of getting a journalist's attention and how people can do that. How much does that differ from one publication to the next? Do people need to think about tailoring their story to different publications, or perhaps in the case of targeting a broadcast outlet, supporting that with the right filming opportunity, for example?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think this is the key thing that perhaps people who don't work in journalism can struggle to understand. That there are lots of, people talk about the media. There's lots and lots of different types of publications. You've got national papers, you've got local papers, you've got professional magazines, you've got business to business titles. And then, as you say, you've got the whole suite of these programs, again, within the broadcast space. And they're all going to be interested in slightly different things. If you're sitting, as I was, at Digital Health and you're wanting to write about the technology, if you've got a project that's fantastic, it needs a technology element, and it needs to be clear why that technology element is newsworthy to grab my attention. Whereas perhaps if I was working for a finance publication, I'd want to know all about the finance aspect of it. So being very clear about which publication you really want to be seen in, and then what they're going to be interested in, is absolutely critical, because that's the job that journalists see themselves as doing. So if you're not helping them to do what they see as their job, they're not going to cover your story.
Linked to that, what other things can people do to make it easier for you to cover their story? For example, that might be having the right evidence. It might be making sure that people are available to interview, for example.
Yes, one of my pet hates as a journalist was getting a release or an email about something that sounded really great, and then ringing up and them saying, oh, the key person you need to talk to has gone on holiday and they won't be back for 6 weeks. It's just like, don't do that. You're just wasting the time of very busy people. Absolutely. I think it goes back to what I was saying right at the start. Be very clear yourself about what story it is that you want to tell, who you want to tell it to, what's going to grab their attention, and then make sure that you've got the elements lined up. So if they're going to need to talk to someone, make sure that person's available, make sure they're on board, make sure they're going to be happy to talk. If you're going to want to put out a picture or a screen grab, make sure that you've got that available. If you need to anonymize the data, make sure that you've got it all set up so the journalist can have a look, and that's not going to cause you a problem. If it's broadcast, they'll absolutely want to film, so make sure you've got something to film, and make sure you've got all that in mind really before you start, because otherwise, as I say, it just makes it very difficult to progress that story. And with people being so busy, and frankly the media these days being so short of staff and resources, if you don't have it lined up, the story will collapse. They just won't have the time to keep progressing it. So yeah, absolutely. Interviewees, all your facts, line up your pictures, sort out your broadcast if that's what you want to do. Make sure it's ready to go really before you get in touch with your target publications.
What would you advise people then on the things they should avoid? What can put journalists off?
Very salesy pictures. This probably doesn't apply so much to the kind of people that we're making this course for, because they'll probably be working in the NHS and working on a really good project. But clearly, if you're sitting there on a news desk and you get a very salesy pitch from a company, then there can be a temptation to think, if you want advertising, go and advertise. Things that have got lots of jargon. We keep talking about how busy journalists are. They don't have a lot of time to understand what it is you're talking about. So think about explaining your story in really clear words. I often say, well, there's an old journalist saw that says, tell it like you would down the pub. And obviously, if we're talking about an NHS project or a health tech project, it might sound like quite a boring pub conversation. But think about if you walked up to someone at a conference that you hadn't seen for a bit and they said, hi, Joe, what have you been up to? And, you wanted to tell them quickly about, a great piece of work that you'd done, perhaps something you were presenting upon. How would you frame it for them? You wouldn't use a lot of jargon. You wouldn't say, oh, well, 6 months ago we did this, and then, take ages and ages to get to the point. So it's things like that. Don't be over salesy. Don't use lots of jargon. Make sure it's very straightforward. Make sure you've got, that 20-word intro framed up and ready to go, because that's what's going to grab the journalist, same as it's going to grab whoever's reading the story that they put out.
So then let's say people have taken the advice that you've given them today and applied it. They've got their story, it's clear, and they've managed to get the attention of the journalist who then wants to interview them. What would be your advice at that point? Of course, we would always advise people to treat every conversation with a journalist as on the record and simply not to say anything they don't want to appear in print. But not all journalists are out to get you. How can people make the most of those conversations?
I would say most journalists aren't out to get you. Obviously, if we're watching a Sunday politics program and there's, someone wriggling, then the presenter's out to make their name by asking the question and asking got-to questions and trying to generate a headline in the next day's papers. But most of the time, that's not the journalism that most journalists are doing. If you're working for Digital Health and you're trying to cover a story about a big health tech project, you genuinely want to know about that project and why it's good, and to get across the good points to your readers. And if there was a bump on the way, then probably you're going to want to know how you overcame it for the same reason. So I would say most journalists aren't out to get you. They're there to find out more information about what it is that you're trying to tell them about. They're there to get a nice angle on it. Perhaps there was, some funny little incident that happened along the way that will give them a nice grabby intro. They're there to make sure that they've got all the information that their readers are going to want to know. So I would say prepare very well. But don't assume that they're out to get you. And don't forget, if you're asked a question that you're not very comfortable with, you can always, pause, think before you give them an answer. You don't have to, get dragged down a line of questioning if you feel it's not appropriate. When I interview, I always conclude my interviews by saying, is there anything else? Is there anything I haven't asked? Is there anything that I've said that makes you think I haven't quite understood something? If the journalist doesn't do that, you can always do it yourself. Say, just to sum up, thanks ever so much for your time. But just to sum up, this is what we did. these are key points that I'm really hoping came across. Do you feel that came across? And then if, there is a problem, you can go back and just loop back over that part of whatever it is that you've been talking about.
Lynn, that's been really helpful. I'm sure people watching this have picked up lots of useful advice, hopefully things they can apply now, whether they're taking forward stories on their own or whether they're working with a comms team or an external agency to get the message out there about the great work they're doing. Thank you, Lynn. So that concludes this module. Thank you very much for listening. Coming up in the course, we're going to go into more detail about what you can do to raise the profile of your team. We're going to do that through an interview with a former NHS communications manager. And we're going to give you more insight into what you can do to raise your own profile as an individual in the sector and how you can contribute to the conversation. And we're going to bring you an interview to illustrate that with an NHS professional who's done that successfully over many years. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you on the next module.